Hey everybody, welcome to Module 4, the final module of this course, and this is where we're going to be looking ahead. The election is over, more or less. It is Friday, November 13th right now as I record this lecture, and while it's not all completely wrapped up, I think that we can actually say that we're past the election. Obviously, there's two really important runoffs coming in the Senate for the Senate in Georgia, and I'll talk about that when I get to the lecture on what we can expect from the next Congress. This first lecture, is somewhat facetiously titled, "Is American Democracy Dying?" And the reason I title it this is because I've been seeing for a long time, basically since Trump was elected at least, possibly even a little bit before, but since Trump has been elected, a lot of concerns about the erosion of our democracy, about the fact that America is taking an authoritarian drift, that our democracy is unhealthy and unsustainable, lots and lots of worrying and hand-wringing and claims that we're going down a particular path. And so today, in the wake of the 2020 presidential, congressional, and local elections, I want to actually take up this question of, is American democracy dying? And I'm not going to provide a yes or no answer. I'm not going to say, yes, it is dying, or no, it's not dying. I want to look at the various elements of our democratic system to see in what ways we should be concerned and in what ways we maybe don't need to be as concerned. One of the things about a democracy is it is an experiment, right? I love referring to the United States as the American experiment because it still is an ongoing experiment in self-government. And one of the things I think that we can see in the wake of this particular election is that democracy can be messy. It can be unsatisfying. It can be frustrating. It can be just downright ugly. And I think that one of the reasons why it's a good idea to call any democratic system an experiment is because it's really a matter of let's keep seeing if this thing is going to work. So is the American experiment continuing to go well, or is it going awry? Now, there are, I would say, different pieces of the democratic system we have to look at or should look at. There's the two sides of the official system. There's the electoral system, and there's the system of governance. And I want to look at each one of these separately and see how well democracy is doing in each of those particular domains. Then there's the broader political culture, which is essentially, I would say, the cultural, sociological backdrop for any democratic society. A democratic system is a set of institutions, rules, practices, traditions, its constitutional order, its statutes, it is particular roles, it's all of that stuff. It's a system, it's a set of interlocking institutions. That's the democratic system. A democratic society has the democratic system embedded in a broader political culture that is a democratic political culture. And I think that it's useful to look at the institutions separately from the culture, but then also see how they're interacting. So, our electoral system, our system of governance, our political culture, each of these three are what I'm going to go through in this lecture. The electoral system, the purpose of the electoral system is to allow the people to choose their representatives, and in a certain limited kind of way through ballot measures, to allow the people to vote directly on certain policies. But the purpose of the electoral system in general is to choose the people who are going to choose the policies. The system of governance, the purpose of the system of governance is to crank out policies, and the purpose of a system of governance is to make policy, to address problems, and to implement and carry out policy, and to refine policy and to evaluate it. The system of governance is all about essentially doing things. So there's a set of institutions designed to select, and there's a set of institutions designed to implement policy and carry out policy and evaluate policy and make policy. Our electoral system is, I believe, in the wake of this very tumultuous, very contentious election, which the sitting president of the United States is still saying is a fraud, is still saying he was cheated out of it. I think that this election actually demonstrates, for me, that our electoral system is actually really very strong. That American democracy, as far as the mechanism of people casting ballots, having those ballots counted accurately, and having those results being reported and accepted and certified and turning those results into the winners of ballot measures and office holders, I would say that that side of our democratic system is extraordinarily strong and very healthy. And that in the midst of a pandemic, in the midst of a very contentious election, in the midst of an election where a record number of people voted, we have the highest voter turnout rate in a century, and there was all kinds of different ways in which people were able to vote this time that created the potential for chaos, uncertainty. Of course, it's leaving the door open for these sort of unfounded charges of fraud. But in the midst of what we could say is one of the most challenging elections, possibly as challenging as the elections that were held during the Civil War, as challenging as even more challenging than elections that are held during wartime, right, with millions of soldiers abroad fighting. Very challenging conditions. What we ended up with, and we're still in the process of finalizing a lot of the court challenges that are really just kind of marginal things that happen all the time, and there are still places that are just finalizing the last counts of the votes. Today in Georgia they started a hand recount, which should conclude by Wednesday. But I would say that all that I've seen, and we as Americans have actually seen a lot more under the hood of the electoral system than we normally do, that system is running really well. And what is the basic nature of our electoral system? It is a state-run, county-based human system whereby election officials have the job of making ballots available to people, receiving those ballots, certifying that those ballots are valid, making sure that the people who cast those ballots are legitimate voters in that state, and then counting and reporting those results. That's a massive effort. We're talking about in any given state, millions of votes, right? Georgia is recounting 5 million votes, 5 million pieces of paper that are part of our electoral system, and that there will probably be some slight change in the vote totals for the presidential election, but it's unlikely to be over the 10,000 votes that's needed to change that from Biden to Trump. And in any system, there's going to be like a 1% error in any human system. A 1% error is pretty low, but also completely understandable. So it could end up changing. So 5 million votes, 10% is 550,000 votes. It's not even going to change 1%. It's probably going to change a couple hundred votes. So less than 0.1%. If you have a 0.1% margin of error in a 5 million data point in human endeavor, that's pretty astounding. Legitimacy is a big concern too. Do Americans feel like these results are legitimate? Do the people who are running this system, are they reliable? Are they trustworthy? Is there a reason to believe that there's widespread cheating or fraud or some kind of chicanery? What's great is that from the county level and the state level, Democrats, Republicans, the people who are charged with running our electoral system are saying, we did this exactly right. We're also getting claims out of the federal government that there was the most secure election ever, that there were not security threats, that databases haven't been hacked, that there have not been successful incursions by foreign adversaries into the vote tabulation. So in probably the most tumultuous imaginable election in my lifetime for sure, and one of the most sort of rife for problems with a global pandemic and a president like Donald Trump behaving as though our democratic system is basically just fraud-ridden. The counts have taken place. Democratic and Republican election officials have come out and said, we're doing a great job, here's accurate. There have been live streams of counting rooms, there's been observers. All of the court cases that basically have been brought up about lack of ballot observation access for the different sides have been settled or thrown out as showing that there's no irregularities, that there's maybe just a couple of normal things like, okay, the Trump people asked to be 6 feet closer or within 6 feet of the ballot counters and they were being held further back, so they moved them forward. All of these little things at the edges demonstrate that, and the fact that that's all there is a couple of things at the edges, that our electoral system is actually, that we get free, fair, and open elections. Now, the other question about our electoral system is not just what happens with the ballots and with the reliability and accuracy, but with access. Do people have the ability to go vote when they want to vote? Is there or is there not successful voter suppression? And I would say that this is an area where we can be a little more concerned about the health of American democracy. Are there people who want to vote who have obstacles that keep them from voting? Are there choices that are made by election officials that make it more difficult for certain kinds of people to vote? I think the answer there is also yes. But one of the other things this election demonstrates is that when people are highly motivated, even when there are obstacles, if there are not official barriers, obstacles make it harder for people to vote. And it will, the fewer polling places there are, the shorter the time period to go cast your vote, the greater distance that you have to go to cast a vote, the likelihood that there's a long line versus a short wait. All of those are factors that are going to depress voter turnout. And so those are, I would call that voter suppression light. Real voter suppression is when you prevent people from voting, when you purge them from the rolls, when you create laws that block people who are legitimately entitled to vote. You make it impossible for them to vote. So some of that does go on, right? There is voter roll purging. There are some laws that, as far as the identification that's required in certain states, that hit closer to what I would call hard voter suppression. But there's very little of that compared to soft voter suppression, which is creating more obstacles for people to vote. And those obstacles tend to fall more heavily on people who are poorer and minority groups. To the extent that we have soft voter suppression means that our electoral system could be healthier. Is it dying or is it getting better? Is it getting less healthy or is it getting healthier? I think that we're at a point where for a long time our electoral system was getting healthier and healthier. In other words, there was less and less voter suppression and there was greater access to the polls for formerly excluded groups. I think that we're now in a period where that may be reversed a little bit, especially with the Supreme Court striking down certain important pieces of the Voting Rights Act, and with the ability of states to basically close polling places and create greater shortages of places to go vote, increasing lines. But at the same time, we've also now seen, and I expect following this particular election, I expect Americans to demand ease of access. I think that our love of convenience as a sort of a broad culture is going to create a movement where voters, they don't want to have to go on election day. I think that we're going to be looking at the reality nationwide of election month, and that election day is actually election deadline day, not election day. And that more and more Americans will get used to the idea that you don't vote on election day. You vote anytime up until election deadline day. And that would be a move in an even healthier direction. And I think that's coming. I could be wrong about that, but I think that the sort of the access that people had to the polls this year because of the response to the pandemic are going to give Americans a taste for easier ballot access. Now, of course, to get those rules through is going to require legislative action at the state level, and that can be difficult because there are going to be elected officials who don't want to increase ballot access, who are happy with soft voter suppression, or who are happy to not dedicate the full resources that are necessary to make sure everybody has access to the ballot box who wants to get there. But I would say that in terms of accuracy, counting, openness, transparency, can we rely on the vote totals that get shown, that show up and that decide who wins and who loses? I think that we have an extraordinarily healthy democracy. There was a team of observers from Europe that was invited by the State Department, and this is kind of a thing that gets done all the time, and these are observers that go to all kinds of democratic countries to observe elections and give a report. The European observers were stupendously impressed, as you would hope they would be with American democracy, the flagship democracy of the world, incredibly impressed with all of our electoral procedures, with the openness, the transparency, the fairness, the accuracy of our electoral system. Their basic main criticisms were for Donald Trump casting doubt on the legitimacy of the election, and that is a legitimate concern. But as far as the actual processes go, they were extraordinarily impressed, which they should be. we have soft voter suppression going on, and I would say that that is a place where our democracy could be healthier. But I think it's pretty healthy. Now, moving on to the system of governance. People who get to be in office. How effectively can those people do what they're supposed to do? Make policy, address problems in a proactive way, come together to find pragmatic solutions to the things that the nation is facing, implementing those policies, evaluating them, making them better. This is an area where I think that the partisanship and the growing ideological divide between the two major parties is creating, I would say, significant obstacles to, at the federal level, policy moving forward in a proactive way of addressing the problems that we're facing. It is become increasingly difficult to get major legislation through. It's become increasingly difficult to even just get the annual budget passed in any kind of responsible way. And for the most part, that is because of the growing partisan divide. It's at this point, in order to get something done, you have to have a unified federal government. Both houses of Congress and the presidency have to be in control of one party strongly, and even then it can be difficult to bring your party together on the same particular agenda. But when that's the case, and when that situation is rare, Donald Trump had it for 2 years, Barack Obama had it for 2 years, George Bush had it for 2 years, Bill Clinton had it for 2 years. Most presidents don't get very much time with that. We as a people don't get very much time with unified government. And that is largely because our electoral system returns results that tend to divide government. The increasing sort of hard line of the different parties, party line votes. You know, if you're a Republican in the House of Representatives, you don't ever cross the aisle to vote for a Democratic bill, and vice versa. Same thing in the Senate. It's very rare for anybody in either of the parties to vote for a piece of legislation that's favored by the other party, and there's very little coming together to craft bipartisan legislation, except on relatively trivial matters, and then of course the budget, which it takes basically either a shutdown or a shutdown threat to get the Democrats and Republicans to govern together. So how well is our system of governance working? At the legislative level, at the national legislative level, not well. How well is the executive branch and the judicial branch doing their jobs? I would say that while we've seen a decline in good governance from the Trump administration, in other words, just not doing the job of running the executive branch very effectively, lots of positions unfilled, essentially gutting the professional political class and the civil service. I won't say gutted is a little strong, but eroding it, I think that's a problem for governance, and I think that one of the things that the Biden administration is going to be seeking to do is to build back just basic ground level executive branch governance, doing the job effectively, doing it well. And the nice thing about a sort of mainstream conventional politician like Joe Biden is he has all the connections and all the people to start an administration with lots of experience, with people who have that kind of civic pride and that kind of job pride, who want to do their job well and who want to make the executive branch function effectively. I think that one of the interesting things about the partisan divide is that Republicans don't necessarily want the executive branch to function well because they have a small government ideology, and when the government doesn't run well, that doesn't hurt them because people say, see, the government doesn't run well, we want less of it. So there is really less incentive for Republicans to make sure that their governance is good governance. Now, and I think that's one of the things that happens when we have these cycles, these electoral cycles for the presidential administration, is that we get two different versions of the presidential administration. We get the Republican version and the Democratic version, and while the Trump administration's version, I would say, is probably the most sort of dysfunctional type of Republican administration we could get, it still didn't fall apart, right? The federal government still does its job, even though it doesn't do it as effectively as it might. So at the executive level, I would say that we still have a relatively healthy democracy. Our government still functions. States, I think, are very extraordinarily effective governance mechanisms. And I think that we're seeing an awful lot of that during the pandemic. We're getting to see state health officials, county health officials. We're getting to see the kinds of things that are usually transparent to Americans. What where are government officials doing things in our communities? Typically, we only see problems, we don't actually see the solutions. And I think that at the state and local level, our systems of governance are functioning pretty effectively for the task that they have set before them, which is to do basically so much. Education, transportation, health, criminal justice, security. It is a really gargantuan task. So I would say that our electoral system is healthy, and there's soft voter suppression that can definitely be dealt with, and so there is some room to grow and room to improve. I would say our system of governance is relatively healthy, though there are definitely ways in which there are problems, and I would say particularly the biggest area of difficulty is the highest profile and probably the most important one, which is legislative leadership from the United States Congress. And that is very difficult to do when you have divided government. It's very difficult to do when you have majorities shifting back and forth. It's very, very difficult to do when you have two parties that have policy platforms and ideologies that are increasingly separating them. That brings me to our political culture. The background attitude about politics, about democracy, the background conditions about how people interact, what kind of political discourse we have, how productive is it, how healthy is our political discourse. This, I think, is an area where we have a real reason for concern. And mostly, and I won't go all the way into it because there could be a lot said on this, but the fact that in a democratic society, what you have is you have competition between different groups of people who have different ideas about how the country should go, which direction the country should go, what policies should be implemented, what things should be tried, what things should be rejected. There's always in a democratic society going to be competition, and that's what the electoral system is for. The electoral system is the set of institutions that allow that competition to play out. And I think that insofar as people cast their votes and those votes get counted accurately and turned into people who actually then get to hold public office, we have a pretty healthy institutional system. Is our political discourse a healthy one? And what would be a healthy political discourse? What would it look like? What are the characteristics that we would judge a political discourse by to see if it's healthy? I would say one of the primary ones is, do people who disagree talk to each other, or do they argue past each other? Do they have an interest in actually a discussion, or do they just want to win the debate? Are political opponents trying to convince voters to back their way of looking at the country and looking at environmental policy and healthcare policy and tax policy? Or are they trying to manipulate voters and trying to score political points and put up versions of political theater that will get people to follow them without necessarily thinking through these policy problems and thinking what they want the world to be like? And I would say that on that criteria, do we have a discussion? Do we have a conversation? Do we have talking and listening? I would say that is an area where American democracy is definitely struggling the most. The fact that our political discourse tends to now really come in a big way from two competing echo chambers where the different sides get different information, they get different messaging, and in some ways they actually maybe are looking at two different worlds. It's one world, right? Reality is out there, but there are two different perspectives on what that world is, and those perspectives, to the extent that they're not commensurate with each other, to the extent that they actually are essentially different worlds, even though they're supposed to be the same one, makes it very difficult for political opponents to talk to each other, to speak with each other, to dialogue and discuss, and even debate based on the merits. What it seems like we have an awful lot of is yelling past each other, and when that's the case, when you're a political operative, when you're running for office, or when you're a strategist, or when you are leading an interest group, and you want to win your side, you want to win votes, you want to get your policies enacted, you aren't necessarily trying to convince other people to back you or to make a reasonable case based on ideas, evidence, logic. If you are basically just trying to rally the people who support you already, to energize them, and to not care about anybody else, but to look for victories where you can get them, then I would say that we do not have a particularly healthy democratic political culture. Another thing about democracy I think that's important in terms of the broader political culture is, do people believe in democracy as the best process for working out our collective problems and deciding collectively what will be the common good, what will be the rules that govern all of us? Do people believe that democracy is the best way to do that? Or do they want to win, and that democracy is maybe the way, that our democratic system is the system that we have to work through to win, but victory is more important than adhering to the principles of the democratic system? Put differently, do people see democracy as a means to an end? Right? The democratic system is how you get to your victories that you want. You get the policies that you want. Or do people see it as an end in itself, as good in itself, that it is the process that whatever the outcome, win or lose, or compromise, that democracy itself is the right way for us as a community, as a state, as a nation, to go about addressing our differences of opinion on what's right and wrong, to go about addressing our common problems and our individual problems and problems that only apply to certain groups? Do we believe that democracy is the right way to do that, and that whatever ends up happening, whoever ends up winning, that we'll fight on another day, but that's the right answer? Or do we want to win? Is our policy, is our favorite things, is the outcomes more important? And the democratic system is maybe just an annoying obstacle to that, right? And I think that, unfortunately, I think that more and more political operatives are seeing the democratic system as a means to an end, as opposed to an end in itself. And that's when you get things like essentially gaming the system, working within the rules, not necessarily violating the law, but not necessarily upholding the spirit of democracy. And I think that this is one of the things that has come along over the course of decades, is the sense that our democratic system is not an end in itself, that we should value that process. Because the process of democracy means fighting for your side, arguing with other people, but it also means discussing, debating, listening, and accepting that maybe if you don't win, it's because the other side was stronger, had a better case, had more public support. The evidence is on their side, right? If you accept defeat and still fight, keep fighting on to try to turn defeat into victory, because a democratic process is, or democratic society is an ongoing process, then you believe in democracy as an end in itself. If you're just like, well, you know what tools are lying around here in our democratic system that allow us to win, to get the policy victories that we want, because winning is more important than adhering to some kind of collective decision-making process. That, I think, is a corrosive to a democracy. We can still have democratic institutions. We can still have democratic elections that are free, open, fair, transparent, accurate, if the spirit is that the democracy, our democratic system, is a game that we're playing, but what's really important is winning, and that the game itself is secondary, then I think that you can have very strong institutions, electoral and governance institutions, and yet you can say our democracy is not as healthy as it should be. And to me, I don't necessarily fear that we are at a terminal case of an unhealthy democracy that way, but it feels to me like American political culture is potentially sick at this point. We have a bad cough, and hopefully that cough will get cured, but it could turn into a death rattle, and it could really lead to, even if we still have democratic institutions, democratic elections, and the first two things I talked about still function well, if we end up seeing our politics essentially turn into a war of all against all, into nothing but a battle for policy outcomes, as opposed to, of course, that's what democracy is. We're trying to get our people elected so our people will pass the policies that we want. If you're doing that in a way where you're just like, oh, we got to do everything we can to win, then I think that's problematic. And I think that we're seeing signs of that in America today. Hopefully, the sort of surge of concern about the voting system that this 2020 election has demonstrated in the American people also will lead people to realize, like, okay, I think that we actually have to value the outcome of elections and to value the process, that even if you're on the losing side, you are still part of the decision. And so you suffer that loss gracefully, and you continue to work hard to try to win the next time. Not win at all costs, but to try to win. All right, I think I could probably continue spinning out on this particular theme, but these were the three main things I wanted to talk about: the electoral system, the system of governance, and the background political culture. And I would say, taken in totality, I feel like American democracy is not dying, but as I say, I think that our political culture has a cough, and we ought to be concerned about making sure that we can do what it takes to cure up that cough.